Weird science. Science and technology in the 1980s and gaming. What was it like? Let's go over some major highlights first, and then let's go into personal experiences with this technology after. All right, now we're getting to the good stuff. Ooh boy. In 1980, development of Enquire and MS-DOS begin. What is Enquire? Oh wow, so Enquire was a software project written in 1980 by Tim Berners-Lee at CERN, which was the predecessor to the World Wide Web. It was a simple hypertext program that had some of the same ideas as the web and the semantic web, but was different in several important... that's unfortunate that Wikipedia truncates the preview, but this is something I've actually been thinking about lately, is it would be great to have a web browser that did not support JavaScript. Things would be so much better in that way. And if that browser were to become popular enough, then websites would have to support this browser, which means without JavaScript. And how great would the world be on the web without JavaScript? How many devices that are considered outdated now because of JavaScript would then be able to run the web again? I would love to invest some time into building a web browser in Rust using Servo or something that just does not support JavaScript. You could still have ad blocking and things like that, but the delivery of ads without JavaScript seems like it would be limited in a way that advertising would be significantly less intrusive. And MS-DOS, 1981, MS-DOS debuts. So this was my first operating system, was MS-DOS. I wasn't like all the cool kids with the Commodore 64. I started out on either an 8286 or 8386 PC. MS-DOS and Windows 3.11 that was the thing back then. 1982. The first compact discs are sold, which would eventually replace the audio cassette in the 1990s. I feel like in the 80s, when you had compact discs, it was more like a hi-fi thing. Like everybody had tapes or audio cassettes, and if you had a compact disc, it was because you were like Patrick Bateman and you had a hi-fi system. That's my memory of compact discs and audio cassettes in the 80s. Pretty much everyone had audio cassettes. If you had sort of legacy or older equipment, then you had 8-track. 1983, computer virus terminology was introduced by Fred Cohen. This was in science fiction, wasn't it? Or was it not? Lotus 123 spreadsheet software was launched. Wow. So Lotus 123 is a discontinued spreadsheet program from Lotus Software. It was the first killer application of the IBM PC. It was hugely popular in the 1980s and significantly contributed to the success of IBM PC compatibles in the business market. So I'm curious. So I remember hearing about Lotus 123 in the 80s and all through the 90s. And this was one of those things where people were like, oh, I can't run Lotus 123 or Lotus Notes. I remember Lotus Notes. I want to say even through the 2000s was like Lotus Notes is a thing. The Lotus software suite or the Lotus programs are something that I'm not familiar with and never ran. I'm curious what people used prior to Lotus 123 for spreadsheet software, because I would imagine that there were other options, but I'm not certain. I know that I am a heavy user of spreadsheets and spreadsheet software. My brain is just too smooth to load everything into other database options. So spreadsheets are my jam. 1984, the Apple Macintosh is released. So back then, I never had an Apple computer in the 80s or 90s. My perception was that these were like sort of luxury computers. They were like the nicer computer, but they were also much more expensive. Oh, but back then, I guess all computers were pretty expensive. But I do remember working on Apple computers in the 80s, and it might have been an Apple IIe. I remember pre-graphical user interface with Apple computers. I remember using Apple computers to play like Oregon Trail, and you use the command prompt to load from disk. I do remember later there being the graphical desktop environment on Apple computers. Was it Mac OS back then? I don't know. But I do remember like when they were teaching computers in school back then, you would learn like how to use a floppy disk, how to load it, I remember on top of the giant CRT monitors, there was like a green cup, and the bottom of it was taped to a red cup. It would be stacked so that the green cup was up. And whenever you had a problem, you would flip the cup over so that the red part was up, which was interesting. I'm really curious if other people remember that or had that experience. I guess raising your hand was not really their expectation in computer class back then. You would flip the cup over and they were just taped. I remember it was the clear tape with like lines in it. I guess that might have given it some sort of structural integrity, but I can't remember the last time I've seen any sort of packing tape like that, but I do remember that. And I remember the computer class was in like a trailer. Like the rest of the school had brick building. It wasn't brick. It must have been brick. It was like brick or cinder block. It was definitely made out of some sort of like concrete material, the regular buildings. But the additional like spillover classrooms were in like a trailer that you had to walk up this ramp. I guess it was like a handicap accessible ramp. I remember because when you walked on it, it was like loud and a little bit bouncy. So I remember that from going to computer class. But yeah, there was a number of different games that they had. Some of it was just like mathematics with like visuals or animations, but the big one that everyone liked was Oregon Trail. And I remember that game being difficult back then. Like, I didn't understand a lot of what was going on. The big part was that you wanted to get to the point where you could shoot animals. That was like the big thing. And then the final boss was like the river crossing. Very few people got to the river crossing. Anytime in class someone got to the river crossing, everyone would stand up from their seats and go watch the person. And it was like, wow, if you didn't have experience doing that, just think of the pressure being at a young age in computer class and you get to the final boss and then everyone gets up and they're like watching you play. That was just a different time with computers, the excitement. And I don't know if there's sort of anything comparable these days because the way games are made, getting to a final boss and beating them just doesn't seem as big of a deal as it was back then. And even if you're watching someone on Twitch like at a final boss, I don't know how often that happens or what the experience is, but I do remember Oregon Trail. The final boss was that river crossing when you finally had some action on screen. In 1984, FidoNet begins. What is FidoNet? A worldwide computer network that is used for communication between bulletin board systems, BBSs. It uses a store and forward system to exchange private email and public forum messages between the BBSs and the network as well. It would be nice if these previews that Wikipedia offers either showed the full explanation or truncated it in a way that wasn't so abrupt. But prior to 1984, where there are bulletin board systems, and was that just limited to local networks? You couldn't dial to them? Is that what FidoNet allowed, was dialing to each other? Or is FidoNet something different? This is something that sounds interesting. What I'm curious about is what was the bandwidth of FidoNet back then? Is this something that like Meshtastic could do now with the bandwidth we have? Of course, you would have to have applications that were mindful of bandwidth. But is Meshtastic like the modern day equivalent of FidoNet? I'm curious if there's anyone that has experience with FidoNet. If they'd be willing to leave a comment, I would love to hear about it. 1985, the first domain names are registered on the internet. I'm curious if there's a list anywhere of like what the first domains registered were, like the first 100 or so. I'm assuming at that point, whoever built the system could just register whatever they wanted and there wasn't a cost involved. But I don't know. When was registration of domain names? When was a cost involved? That I would be interested in knowing. If anyone registered a domain name in the 80s, I would love to know what that experience was like. Because now you can just go on a website and register. Back then, I would assume there wasn't the degree of automation that we have now. Would you have to like print something up and mail it in? I don't know. Could you register it through a bulletin board system or email? That I don't know. What was early domain names like? Also in 1985, Windows 1.0 debuts. So Windows 1.0, I'm not familiar with. I definitely remember Windows 3.10 or 3.11. I remember the Windows 3 days, I should say. I might have had some experience with Windows 2, but not on my own systems. or it could have been Windows 1. Like, this is pretty early on. I have no idea what the experience would have been like back then on Windows 1.0, because you would have been coming from MS-DOS. So I have no idea what that experience would have been like. 1986, the TCP/IP-based NSFNet, the forerunner to the internet, begins construction. Maybe I was confusing FidoNet with NSFNet. What is the difference between them? The National Science Foundation Network, NSFNet, was a program of coordinated, evolving projects sponsored by the National Science Foundation from 1985 to 1995 to promote advanced research and education networking in the United States. So is 1986 when people began going online? More than just a local network, but being able to dial out? That's the question I really have, because that's when I feel like the internet truly existed. Once you could dial out and connect to remote places, I feel like that was the beginning of the internet. So was that FidoNet? Was that NSFNet? I'm not sure. 1987, the first popular hypermedia software, HyperCard, is released by Apple. Hypermedia, an extension of hypertext, is a nonlinear medium of information that includes graphics, audio, video, plain text, and hyperlinks. This designation contrasts with the broader term multimedia, which may include non-interactive linear something. So I'm not sure what hypermedia software was. HyperCard is a software application and development kit for Apple Macintosh. So I feel like this listing is here because the history of Apple is reasonably well documented, but I'm not sure I recall hypermedia. I mean, I remember multimedia CDs, but I'm not certain what hypermedia is. 1988. While working on networking computers at CERN, Tim Berners-Lee, this is the virus person, I think, begins to discuss the possibility of a hyperlinked information system with his colleagues, an idea he was allowed to implement in 1990 when he created the World Wide Web. So there you go. There's the World Wide Web, 1988. I'm curious when it became popularized, because at this point, I believe after BBS's was Usenet, but I'm not sure if that will be listed here in this particular article. Adobe Photoshop graphics editing software debuts, revolutionizing photography and the fashion industry. I had no idea Photoshop was around back in 1988. I'm curious what type of computer would have been required and what the capability was of graphics editing, revolutionizing photography. So I'm guessing you could work with digital images back then. I'm curious. I'm guessing they had scanners also? I don't know. I have no idea what the experience would have been like with Adobe Photoshop back in the 80s. That sounds interesting. November 2nd, Robert Tapan Morris created the Morris worm, considered the first notable computer worm to be distributed via the internet. The worm was launched from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, and caused considerable damage. In 1989, its creator became the first person indicted under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Wow. I will have to look this up later because I'm curious if the intent of the Morris worm was damage, and I'm curious what the damage might have been of the Morris worm. Let's see if there's anything helpful in the little preview. The Morris worm, or internet worm, of November 2nd, 1988 is one of the oldest computer worms distributed via the internet and the first to gain significant mainstream media attention. It resulted in the first felony conviction in the US under the 1986 Fraud and Abuse Act. So this is that it wasn't super helpful. I'm curious what kind of damage could be made with a worm on the internet back in the 80s. And it's also interesting to think about how was it spread. But there you go. Our pure, clean internet was soiled with the Morris worm in 1988. December, Europe obtains its first permanent connection to the internet by satellite between Princeton University and Stockholm, Sweden. It's interesting because you hear so many stories about places in the north of Europe being like so far ahead and people like understanding and figuring things out. Like I feel like Finland and Sweden were they just like the, I don't know, I don't want to say anything and get in trouble. But it seems like there were some, in these more remote places, people were pretty bright. If they're using a satellite, they're not just connecting to the internet, they're using a satellite. That's pretty amazing. I'm curious, did they launch their own satellite, or was this an existing satellite that they tied into? Was this an American satellite? 1989. Lotus Notes software launched. So Lotus Notes, I don't know if it's been discontinued, but Lotus Notes, I don't know how it's managed to last so long. I'm not even certain what it does. Is it like a database? HCL Notes is what it's called now. Is a proprietary collaborative software platform for Unix, AIX, the AIX operating system. IBM, I'm not sure what that is. Windows, Linux, Mac OS, sold by HCL Tech. The client application is called Notes, while server component is branded HCL Domino. Wow. So did HCL purchase from IBM? You got to think, when IBM is ready to sell something that's been around, I feel like that's the end of life of that product. Is it just legacy support that HCL offers, or is it still actively being developed? Does anyone still use HCL Notes, Lotus Notes? June, July of 1989, MCI Mail and CompuServe gateway their email systems to the internet, instantly allowing hundreds of thousands of users the ability to email people on the internet for the first time. So prior to that was MCI Mail. You could only email to other MCI Mail customers, and the same for CompuServe. Was that how it worked? And then once the protocol was determined for interchange between the two, is that what started email on the internet? 1989? Were there other email providers other than MCI Mail or CompuServe? And when did they appear? I remember in the 90s, Yahoo Mail was a thing, and Hotmail was a thing, which Microsoft later bought Hotmail. 1989, the first commercial internet service provider emerged, with the World STD being the first dial-up internet service in November. So this is it. This seems like when the internet began after BBSs, or bulletin board systems. This is it, 1989. It's the end of the 80s when this occurred. In the 80s, in astronomy, the rings of Neptune were first discovered in 1984. The Voyager 2 spacecraft provided images of them in 1989. Just think about what it must have been like back then, seeing the rings of Neptune for the first time visually after not knowing they existed. This is a little early for me, but I'm curious for those who were around at that time, what their experience would have been like. 4769 Castalia was discovered in 1989. It became the first asteroid to be viewed through radar imaging. So I guess we never had images of asteroids prior to that? Or could you see asteroids through telescopes at that point or not? I don't know. This is definitely not my strong area, astronomy. The first exoplanet is discovered in 1988, though it was not confirmed until much later. How much later? I'm not even sure what an exoplanet is. Oh, so it's a planet outside the solar system. So it's an exoplanet of our solar system? I probably shouldn't say our, possessive, the solar system we're in. The KT extinction event, when dinosaurs became extinct, was shown to be linked to excess iridium in the boundary layer, which implies that the cause was a massive meteor strike. Wow. So this was determined in the 80s. All my life, I feel like this information was sort of taken as like, this was our understanding. I'm curious, people who lived through the 70s and earlier, how is it hearing this news? I guess what were the assumptions prior to that as to why dinosaurs became extinct? Did people care? Now, let's have a look at gaming in the 80s.